again. Hello again, and welcome to Introduction to Diversity. Again, my name is Kevin. We're going to be studying chapters 7 and 8 today, looking at the experiences of African Americans. Throughout this class, we've talked about the origin of race, where races come from, how races were socially constructed. So we have very clearly defined upper classes and lower classes. And one of the first groups to get subjugated beyond the Native Americans and indentured servants in the United States were Africans, who many came over enslaved by Europeans. Again, slavery's been around a long time. If you look at human history, pretty much every group has been enslaved at one time, okay? Including the British. So the British, again, were slaves to the Vikings. They were slaves often to the Romans, okay? It's not the first time that the British people and the Irish were also enslaved themselves. And Africa had been engaging in the slave trade for thousands of years. The slave trade was part of an African economy. But Europeans, when the age of imperialism came, slave trading then became big business. Okay, Africans would go to war, they would enslave other Africans, they would bring them to the coast, and then they would sell them to Europeans. Okay, so again, when we're going to start pointing fingers, we need to always be thinking about history, because again, Africans were enslaving other Africans. You know, white people were enslaving other white people. It's just always been that way, okay? The Romans enslaved the Greeks. The Persians enslaved the Greeks. The Greeks enslaved the Romans. It's just back and forth throughout all of human history, guys. You're going to see this, okay? So slavery's been around for a long time. It's been a part of human history for a long time. But in modern times, you definitely start to see a change. Now, we're not necessarily slaving people like we used to, but currently there's, a couple million Muslims interned in China. Women are commonly put into sex trafficking, and so are men. So there are other forms of slavery, and we'll get into a little bit of that when we talk about sex and gender and things, and the oppression of women. But for now, we're going to be talking about the experiences of African Americans. Okay, and again, the experiences of African Americans in the United States, you have no choice but to start with slavery. So where does slavery really come from? Again, we needed this lower class workforce. So Europeans, they went to Africa, grabbed slaves, brought them to the United States to make a lower class workforce. So the beginning history of African Americans is their lives began in bondage, okay? African Americans were segregated from whites, and then whites used institutional exclusion and racism and discrimination and prejudice to suppress an entire group of African Americans to maintain that lower class workforce. So again, the idea of race, it's all about economics. There's no biological basis for race. Races were created so we can have a lower class workforce, okay? Because whites, they wanted to enjoy the rights and privileges that non-whites did not have. They wanted power over another group. They wanted to be a majority over a minority, okay? So again, they invented these things called the slave codes. They stripped them of their culture. They made no marriage was allowed for slaves. They wouldn't let them have commerce. No weapons, liquor, okay? Their entire lives were controlled by the slave owner, okay? And violations were not sanctioned. Okay. So again, England, for example, despite engaging in the slave trade, also ended the slave trade before the United States. It took the United States an entire civil war to overcome slavery, and even the Civil War wasn't necessarily totally about slavery to begin with, but by 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, it becomes about slavery, okay? So early abolitionists have been fighting to end slavery for a long time. So this happened way before the Civil War. People have been fighting for the rights, human rights, okay? So abolitionists had attempted to free blacks and natives prior to the Civil War. Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth gained notoriety during this time in the 1850s, and I'm constantly quoting Sojourner Truth when I'm talking about intersectionality, and I start talking about the idea of, does a white woman experience being a woman the same as a black woman? And Sojourner Truth comes out during this abolitionist movement and is like, no, a white woman only experiences sexism, whereas a black woman experiences both racism and sexism. So the idea of being a woman is very different. So I love Sojourner Truth. If you guys ever get a chance to read some of the things she said, I actually think I might have posted some of that in our discussions that we've had, but really interesting. Frederick Douglass, again, early abolitionist, But Frederick Douglass was also kind of supporting this idea of Africans remaining segregated, okay? So it took a long time for this idea of complete integration to even be part of the Black community, for example, okay? The Constitution of the United States historically supported slavery. It was built in. You have the one-drop rule, the three-fifths rule. So again, our founding fathers had a chance to give liberty and justice for all, but instead they denied minorities and women the right that all Americans are supposed to be guaranteed, okay? So that's why we still have these issues going on today with sexism and racism, because our country was founded on sexism and racism, where women were not allowed to vote, minorities were not allowed to vote, okay? But then comes 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, and by 1865, abolition becomes the law, okay? But during 1867 to 1877, you had the Reconstruction Act, where the idea and the overall goal was great, which was to empower an entire group of people. But what ended up happening is, that the way the social system looked prior to the Civil War, it ended up pretty much still just like that. Despite the idea that we abolished slavery, we didn't abolish segregation, and we didn't make it so non-whites could gain capital and work their ways out of the lower classes, for example. Now, right after the Civil War, you see this initial interaction where whites and blacks are like, yay, we can finally begin to be together. We don't have to be segregated anymore. But then along comes the Jim Crow laws in the area of segregation that lasts all the way from 1890s all the way through the 1960s, 1970s. Still some of that segregation going on in modern times, okay? Williams v. Mississippi. This is the constitutional use of poll taxes, literacy tests, and residence to restrict voting. So again, these Jim Crow laws came out to, again, make sure segregation stayed in place. And then they created all these different methods to keep African Americans from being able to compete in the market and be able to work their way up out of the lower classes, okay? So currently, there's 40 million African Americans living in America, and still most of them live in the Southeast, okay, which are historically the plantation states, because again, that's where they were originally brought to, and that's where their roots come in. So again, is there an association between African American culture and the South? I mean, of course, it's undeniable, because that's where most of the slaves were brought to initially. So even after the Civil War, segregation was pretty bad with the Jim Crow laws, especially in the South. But even in the North, you had these ideas of the sundown towns. Okay, these are racially exclusive areas. So even after the Civil War, neighborhoods remained segregated, towns remained segregated. And these sundown towns was this idea that, if you're African American, don't stay here after dark. Okay, because again, African Americans, they weren't welcome everywhere. They weren't welcome in every neighborhood, okay? There were all kinds of segregation laws, residential laws built in to make sure that cities, communities remain segregated, that the schools remain segregated, okay? All right. So African Americans fought in both World War I and World War II, okay? And after each one of them, because African Americans had gone and fought for their country, okay? They came back expecting to be part of it, to be part of Americans, like we fought for you. And they came back after both wars to a same segregated environment. Okay, and so you see that right after World War I, you get the race riots. Right after World War II, you get these race riots. One of my favorite books ever is Invisible Man, and Invisible Man is the story about the disillusionment of an African American after fighting in World War II. So Ralph Ellison goes and he fights in World War II, and he comes back and he receives that same discriminatory treatment, okay? And it just breaks his heart. So he ends up writing Invisible Man. If you get a chance to read that book, I read it sophomore year of high school, changed my attitude and all kinds of things, okay? In the 1940s, though, you start to see a little bit of a change, okay? So again, we had these legal residential segregation rules put in place, legal laws. But in the 1940s, these people came forward and were like, no. So we started this next wave of this African American movement where even the courts were starting to support this idea that segregation is bad. So again, Jim Crow gets challenged in 1944. African Americans that worked in the Porter cars were striked in 1941. By 1948, you start to see that all these residential segregation laws are being found as unconstitutional, and all of a sudden, African Americans find out that the Supreme Court worked for them. Okay, they have a friend in the Supreme Court, okay, because the Constitution says liberty and justice for all, except for that three-fifths law. So we, again, had to get rid of that. So in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court says you can no longer segregate schools. That's unconstitutional. It's not American. Okay. So Eisenhower sends in troops, and then you have all the story of, Alabama and the little children trying to go to school, and all the white people are sitting outside harassing them. I mean, if you watch the videos, they're on YouTube, for example, they're really powerful. Okay. But again, even though you see this starting to happen, once they started to integrate the schools, what happened? You see this white flight to the suburbs, okay? Because white people didn't want to go to school with African Americans. So once the African Americans started going to their school, all the white people left and fled out to the suburbs where the taxes were higher and you needed a car to get to. And if you didn't have capital, it was really hard to get out there. Property taxes went up, you know what I mean? And so African Americans, they weren't necessarily able to move out to these really nice suburbs with these great education systems. So a lot of them got stuck in the inner cities. And so a lot of minorities got stuck in the inner cities while all the money moved out to the suburbs. And then you have to wonder, why were the cities so rough in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? And that's because you had this white flight, but the white flight also took all the money out of the cities and brought it out to the suburbs, okay? So historically, white schools ended up getting more schools or more money because of the higher property taxes, the more money in the community, than the black schools that were stuck in the lower class communities, for example, okay? Again, in the 1950s, we've talked about this with the idea of the murder of Emmett Till, okay? So Emmett Till was murdered for presumably, maybe, possibly looking or talking to a white woman in the South. He was from Chicago, and he was a very young boy, and two white men came and murdered him and left him in the river. And so they took his body and they brought it back to Chicago, and they had an open casket where thousands of people went through and looked at Emmett Till, and they put the picture of Emmett Till on Life magazine, which was very, very profound in the 1950s to even have a picture like that in a magazine. And the world really saw what racism looked like, okay? We began to see the treatment of whites against blacks and what that actually looked like, okay? And this sparks an entire bus boycott. It sparks Rosa Parks. It starts Martin Luther King's March on Washington, okay? This idea of simple disobedience, that African Americans and other people were not going to tolerate this type of segregation anymore in modern times. So again, this is the beginning of the civil rights movement, okay? So you see this resistance to change, okay? So during the 1950s and the 60s, African Americans began to fight, and white people, of course, come and fight back. One of the saddest ones was the Birmingham church bombing that killed 4 little girls. When you watch the video of that, it's incredibly depressing, okay? So again, you're starting to see this racial violence come up every 40 years. You get it in the 1920s, you get it in the 1940s, you get it in the 1960s and 70s, you get it again in the 1990s with Rodney King, you're getting it again in 2020, okay? So every couple of decades, you see this racial violence breaking out because segregation, and inequality still exists in modern times, and blacks are very frustrated with this, okay? And it makes complete sense, okay? John F. Kennedy was the one who was really pushing for the Civil Rights Act, but he was murdered. So Lyndon Johnson comes in, and Lyndon Johnson was a Texas Southerner who had previously voted against the Civil Rights Act. But you know what? He was like, I'm going to finish what Kennedy started. So Lyndon Johnson gets on the phone, and he calls all the senators from the South, and he says, you are going to vote for the Civil Rights Act. So we do have to thank Lyndon Johnson for this, because he's the one that pushed it through. He's the one that got on the phone, got a hold of the Texas Southerners and all the other Southerners and said, look, you're voting for this. And it got passed, okay? So after this, though, again, you get a lot of the resistance to change, okay? And you get this upswing of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1960s and, some of these subversive acts, okay? And so a lot of it is very dark and a lot of it's sad. And when you watch some of the protest videos and the police in Alabama with the dogs and the hoses and just beating people in the streets just because they want to sit at a lunch counter, it makes you question America a little bit, okay? So again, have things actually changed? Yes, things are better than they were, okay? An African American can vote. An African American can pretty much walk down the street safely in modern times, but have racial relations actually changed, okay? I mean, yes, they have, and they have for the better, but we can't deny this institutional racism that still exists, where people might get hired differentially based upon your name or what culture you are, for example. So again, does this institutional discrimination still exist? And this is what we covered in Chapter 3 when we talked about discrimination, okay? Where you're going to see some of the inequality is educational rates, college degrees, amount of capital, home mortgage acquisition, things like this. This is where you're going to see the life chances of whites compared to non-whites. There are some differentials, and you have to kind of ask why, okay? Are our schools still segregated? I mean, yes, the schools are very much still segregated, okay? Most schools that anyone that is black goes to tend to be 90% black, for example, okay? So we have the segregation in our schools. We still have the segregation in our neighborhoods. It has improved and it is better. But again, that's where we came up with the idea of colorblind racism for you to, because a lot of people are like, yeah, racism, that's gone away. We gave Civil Rights Act, right? Everybody's totally cool, or there's no racism anymore, but there still is racism, and we're seeing it every day, and especially in these modern times with the police brutality that's been going on currently, okay? So economics, so yes, again, African Americans are better off today, but still, they're not closing that gap on the whites. Whites still have more property, more capital in general, better life chances. They're socially located higher in the class system, and because they're socially located higher in the class system, they have better access to healthcare and education and food and wealth, okay? And then when you look at whites versus non-whites in poverty, for example, you find a disproportionate amounts of non-whites in poverty. You have higher unemployment rates for African Americans compared to whites, especially bad for black youth. And you got to ask why. Is that because of institutional discrimination? Is that because of stigmatization attached to black men? This has long-term life implications because people's self-esteem, their self-worth is based upon how we think society views them and how has society perceived African American males for hundreds of years, okay? So again, this idea of black is beautiful, this empowering of an entire group of people is really necessary if we're going to level the playing field and bring it all up, okay? And in order to do that, we have to deconstruct the negative stereotypes, okay? All right. So regarding African American families, two-parent households for African Americans is around 38% compared to 76% for whites. And again, two-parent households tend to have higher economic status. 15% of African Americans are one-parent family maintained by mother, and for whites, it's 51% for blacks. So again, why is, a majority of black women taking care of the children by themselves, whereas the white women have a little bit more help, for example. Again, how does this come from? Is this a cultural thing? Is this because of decades of segregation? Is this because we have not given African American males a chance to compete, for example? Okay. Housing is where the wealth disparity really is. If you really want to level the playing field between whites and African Americans, the real trick is to enable African Americans to get a mortgage on their house. Okay, so mortgage discrimination is really just a major difference between wealth between whites and African Americans. So again, if we can help African Americans buy their house instead of rent, you're going to see this disparity between the two races really shrink. Okay, so again, if black owned houses, there would be a little disparity except for the 1% compared to the rest, okay? Whites simply own more houses, so therefore they're able to gain capital in their homes. In the criminal justice system, this is what we're starting to see, especially in modern times, but it's been going on for decades. Blacks are employed heavily in the system, including in politics when it comes to criminal justice. However, they're also brought into the system much more. Okay, blacks are arrested more than any other race due to poverty and stereotyping. So again, who's more likely to have guns and drugs in their car, an African American or a white person? It's a white person, 2 times to 1, okay? A white person is more likely to have drugs and guns in their car than a Latino or an African American. But who do the police stereotype and who do the police target? They target poor people, okay? And many African Americans were stuck in poverty for a long time, stuck in the culture of poverty. Same thing with Hispanics, okay? So this is where the police are targeting, okay? They're targeting races and they're targeting poor people, even though that white people are also poor and are more likely to have guns and contraband, okay? So there's 523,000 African Americans in prison. So again, this institutional discrimination, this institutionally locking up people heavily is pointed after African Americans when white people are more likely to be committing the crimes. Okay, 1 in 16 white males will go to prison, whereas 1 in 3 black males will go to prison. But again, 2 to every 1 white males are going to commit crimes over a black male. So this should be flipped. It should be 1 in 3 white males and 1 in 16, because that would be more representative. But again, the police target African Americans and Latinos, even though they're less likely to have any guns or drugs. And most of them are just petty crimes anyhow, and they're locking them up for 8 years for it, okay? 70% of crimes are committed by whites, okay? So again, you are much safer being with the black male than you are with the white male, because the white male is more likely to commit crimes. And just say what you will on that kind of a statement, but the statistics don't lie. Whites are more likely to commit crimes, okay? So again, all right, so differential justice, that's it. Blacks get the book, whites go free, okay? It's a new Jim Crow. These are our new laws. Without the Jim Crow laws, we don't need that anymore. We just send the police into the poor neighborhoods and go pick up 30, 40 people for, having a rock of cocaine or something like that. Which, say what you want about that, I get it. But the idea is, again, is there more drugs in poverty? Yeah. Is there going to be more crime in poverty? Yeah. But who's going to commit the crimes more? White people. Okay. Blacks have less access to health care. They die earlier, primarily from stress. And again, these are social, cultural factors. Okay. It's not because blacks' genetics are worse or that all blacks have heart disease, which is, again, is a rumor. That's just not how race works, okay? It's all about life chances, access to healthcare, it's access to material life, it's access to good jobs, things like that, okay? 20% died to poor health linked to race and class that were avoidable. So again, because of poverty and the race that they were categorized as, that is given them less life chances, which has reduced their quality of psychological and physical health. Okay. So again, the experiences of African Americans, what you guys are looking at in your book, not a lot of it's pretty. I mean, the culture is beautiful and things like that, but the way white people have historically treated them, the way Europeans have historically treated Africans is not a pretty picture. Whenever I look at Belgium, for example, I read a really good book about the King of Belgium going into raping the Congo, for example. And so whenever I look at Belgium and the beauty, what do I actually see? I just see the backs of the Congolese, because that's really who built Belgium, So it'll just kind of make you rethink stuff. Can we point fingers? Should we point fingers? A lot of good moral, ethical questions, to be asking. Was it justified for the Europeans to go in and enslave entire groups of people? No, but was that already happening? Yes. Are we to judge people 500 years ago in the past, or is that ethnocentric? Should we be more culturally relativistic? So again, I'll leave it up to you guys to judge history. Do we judge our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson? They had a chance. They had a chance to end slavery. Instead, they decided to oppress people. So, think what you will. Good luck with African Americans in this chapter. If you guys have any questions, please email me, and thank you so much.